What's got 4 wheels, the aerodynamics of a brick, yet weighs so little you almost need to anchor it down on a breezy day? The Lotus Elise Series 1. Here's a detailed history of it. As always, let's kick off with the name and why it was chosen. Well, Lotus pretty much entirely name their cars by following one of 2 rules. The cars are either named by using their type number designation, such as the Lotus 7, or by choosing a name which almost always begins with the letter E. For example, the Lotus Elan, the Eclat, which I've always thought sounds a little bit like an STD, and the Evora. Of course, it's clear that the Elise followed the latter of these naming methods, and the name Elise was chosen by Lotus's then chairman, Romano Artioli, in loving homage to his granddaughter, Elise Artioli. Elise Artioli was actually sat in the Lotus Elise as it was unveiled to the world for the very first time at the Frankfurt Motor Show in 1995. But the unveiling of the Elise and the choosing of its name occurred well after the project began. The story of the Lotus Elise begins in January of 1994, when Lotus decided to make a new, lightweight sports car, a sort of spiritual successor to the aforementioned Lotus 7. But Lotus didn't actually turn to their own celebrated creation as a source of new ideas. In fact, their primary source of inspiration didn't come from a car at all, but from Ducati's motorbikes. Richard Rackham, the Elise chassis designer, and Julian Thompson, the head of design on the Elise project, both owned Ducati superbikes and found the philosophy of pure user engagement and the no-compromise design Ducati utilised to achieve such a level of rider involvement to be something absolutely worth striving to emulate. Richard Rackham actually stated that he wanted the Elise to be just like a Ducati, in the context that, like the bike, he wanted the Lotus to be bought simply as a toy and nothing more. Obviously, cars were also a source of inspiration when designing the Elise. For example, when designing the Elise's body, Julian Thompson took inspiration from Ferraris from the 1960s and 70s when drawing the car's curvaceous shape. A notable example of this is the Ferrari Dino, a car which Thompson himself owns. And of course, Lotus did take inspiration from their own cars, namely the Lotus 23. A car that's stunning looks and lightweight design not only influenced the Elise's aesthetics, but also stood as a reminder to the development team of what a Lotus should be. Lightweight, elegant, and fun. As even Lotus themselves felt that the company had lost its way in recent years from the philosophy adopted by its founder, Colin Chapman. Lotus understood that the need to get back to making cars from their old design philosophy was so serious that the brief for the Elise, given to project manager Tony Shute, was, and I quote, "realise a car that would revive Lotus with the true ideals of the company's founder, Colin Chapman." So no pressure there then, Tony. When the Elise project was given the green light, it was known as Project M111, and early designs were quite different to the car unveiled in 1995. Lotus did briefly toy with the idea of an open wheel design, but they quickly decided that it just wasn't forward thinking enough. Doors proved quite a difficulty for Lotus during Project M111. Initially, the Elise was intended to be a step-in car, meaning it would have no doors and instead you'd step over the side of the car in order to gain access to it, like on the Ariel Atom. However, quite a way into the design process, Lotus realised they made a real rookie mistake. They hadn't thoroughly checked the regulations, and the side of the car where the occupants must step over was just too high. There was no getting around it, they had to redesign, and this time, add doors. The heads of Lotus weren't happy about this at all, as all the extra design and engineering cost the company almost £500,000. I imagine Lotus studied the regulation book a little more thoroughly for the next car they designed. This error with the doors did have a knock-on effect for the design team. The owners of Lotus had a quiver in faith, and because Romano Artioli was the chairman of both Lotus and Bugatti at the time, it was thought that design in Hethel could be ceased and instead handed over to Bugatti's design team over in Italy. In fact, it got to the point where Julian Thompson and the in-house Lotus design team had to compete their design against proposals from 8 other design houses. Fortunately, and as a testament to their ability, The Lotus in-house team's proposal beats all the competition, and design remains at Lotus headquarters in Hethel, Norfolk. However, the doors weren't the only part of the car that the style team were forced to redesign. As previously mentioned, the aesthetic design on the Elise took notes from cars such as the Ferrari Dino. This is evident in the Elise's pronounced front wings, that bulge slightly above the wheels, and its headlights, both in the sense that they're of a cow design on the two cars, and where they sit in relation to the front indicator lights on both the Elise and the Dino. Whilst these features on the front of the car remained intact for production, the rear of the car didn't. Initial designs for the rear of the car had it maintaining the front's curvaceous form, with the upper back end of the car smoothly curling down towards the rear bumper. However, this caused enormous problems in the wind tunnel, with the car being described as about as aerodynamic as a brick. The problem particularly was with the rear of the car lifting up at speed, which of course causes a significant lack of traction and could prove extremely dangerous. There was a lot of consternation between the style design team and the chief aerodynamicist, and after much toing and froing, it was decided that a small ducktail spoiler was to be designed into the back of the car, adding a sharp trailing edge to an otherwise visually soft body, and, more importantly, ensuring the car was better to drive and safer to use. One of the primary reasons the Elise had such issues aerodynamically was due to its size. It's a small car. The Lotus Elise S1 is just 3,726mm long. That's almost 250mm shorter than a Mazda MX-5 Mark II, and over 600mm shorter than a Porsche 986 Boxster. It's also 1,701mm wide, which actually is a tiny bit wider than the Mazda, but still narrower than the Porsche. But in terms of height, due to it needing a high roll bar, at 1,202mm, it's pretty tall compared to its stubby length. Due to this short length, the air meeting the car and passing over the high roll bar is met with quite some resistance, meaning that the Lotus Elise has a drag coefficient of 0.36. That's the same as a 2019 Dodge Ram pickup truck. With that being said, the Elise does have a couple of clever aerodynamic features, such as a flat underside, a big rear diffuser which apparently adds 15 kilograms of downforce, and a clever nose which allows air in through the front grille and then pushes it up and out through the Ford GT40 inspired bonnet vents to create a spoiler. But whilst this is a good reason for a poor drag coefficient, it still means worse fuel economy, a lower top speed, and much more noise in the cabin when travelling at motorway speeds, something I'm sure Elise owners can attest to. Slightly less comfortable motorway journeys weren't much of a concern to Lotus when making the Elise, however. In fact, when talking about the Elise, Richard Rackham said, "I don't treat it at all as transport. That's nothing to do with it." You see, this car was all about fun, and when it comes to the driving experience, it's what you see when you peel away the bodywork that really matters. The chassis, or space frame, is a big deal for 3 reasons. Firstly, the material it's made from. Aluminium. Of course, other cars have aluminium monocoques too, and cars with carbon fibre monocoques were even around when the Lotus Elise was being developed, such as the Bugatti EB110 and the McLaren F1. However, the use of aluminium for a road car chassis was a first for Lotus, and was still mightily impressive, particularly on a car that was to be sold for less than £20,000. It is worth noting at this point, however, that not all of the Lotus Elise's structure is made of aluminium. When stress testing the car at the Millbrook Proving Ground late into development, engineers found cracks were developing in the aluminium rear subframe, and with not enough time left to re-engineer a new aluminium subframe, they opted to switch to a steel one that they could be confident would not fail. The second reason the Elise chassis is a big deal is because of how much of it is extruded. On many cars, the chassis rails, often made from carbon steel, are made by either bending or pressing steel sheets and welding the two ends together to make a seamed rail, or are cast as blocks and then essentially hollowed out when hot by having a rod pushed through the centre. This creates a strong, seamless piece of metal that can be bent to fit as longitudinal or horizontal chassis members. These methods are still used today and remain perfectly suitable for many automobiles. But extrusion is very different. Rather than bending sheet metal to make a shape, or pouring liquid metal to fill a shape, with extrusion you push softened, but not liquid, metal through what's called a die in order to have that metal take a desired form without any need for multiple processes. Here's what I mean. I've put a load of Play-Doh in this big old syringe here, but let's say the syringe is actually filled with a cylinder of softened aluminium. As soon as I squeeze the Play-Doh out, I am actually extruding it by taking it from its original form, which is this big cylinder shape back here, and extruding it to make a solid round pipe instead. If I instead wanted to extrude a square pipe, then all I need to do is add a cap with a square hole to the end of it, like this. This is what's known as a die, and then once added, voila! A square pipe is now being extruded. With this method, one can easily manufacture a metal into all manner of complex shapes and thicknesses to suit the car perfectly. And because it's so labour unintensive when compared to steel chassis rail production, it's a much cheaper process too, which is why Lotus could afford to make the Elise chassis from aluminium in the first place. When realising the potential of extruding aluminium, Richard Rackham kinda got a bit overexcited. He started extruding all the things. Therefore, the Elise has extruded aluminium suspension components, extruded aluminium column brackets, extruded aluminium door hinges, and even extruded aluminium pedals, which it must be said they really are a thing of beauty. Okay, I know I'm getting a bit carried away about the chassis, but here's a little bonus fact about it. So towards the back of the car, the chassis side members bend inwards. This caused many more problems than you'd think. You see, in order for extruded aluminium to harden properly as it needed to for use in a car, it has to be cured in what's essentially a super big oven, and the bending of the extrusions has to take place before the curing, as afterwards the aluminium would just be too stiff to bend properly. However, in Denmark, where the extruding was taking place, there wasn't a press available that was large enough to bend the extrusions according to specification. Therefore, the chassis side rails were extruded in Denmark, transported to the UK where they were bent to shape, then transported back to Denmark to be cured and checked, and then finally transported back to the UK for the rest of the manufacturing process. Now, the third reason the chassis is a big deal is because of how it's all held together. Usually in cars, chassis rails and cross members are all joined together by welding, and Hydro, which is the name of the Danish company that were extruding components for the Lotus Elise, were also extruding and constructing aluminium chassis members for a different car, the Renault Sport Spider. The Renault chassis, which looks fairly similar to the Lotus's, is held together by welding. The Elise's chassis, however, is glued together. By gluing and riveting the chassis parts together, Lotus were able to use much thinner extrusions than on the Renault, as it didn't need to withstand the considerable stress given by welding. And in addition to this, when tested, the bonded and riveted joints proved to be stronger than the welded ones. What this all means is that the Elise has a chassis that's both stiff and strong, and in total weighs an incredibly impressive 68 kilograms. Lotus were all about saving weight when developing the Elise. An example of the lengths they were willing to go for are the brakes. They teamed up with an American firm called Langside in order to fit the Elise with what are called MMC brake discs. MMC stands for Metal Matrix Composite, and at the time it was very new technology. MMC brake discs are made of a combination of aluminium and ceramic fibres, and are considerably lighter and wear far slower than conventional iron discs, whilst offering excellent braking performance in the dry. In the wet, however, they are a good deal less effective than their standard iron counterparts, and it's because of this, and because MMC discs are quite expensive to make, that partway through production of the Elise S1, Lotus opted to start fitting the car with standard iron brake rotors instead. The Elise's exterior body panels are made entirely of fiberglass, which is super lightweight. This of course wasn't a new technology, especially to Lotus, who had been building cars out of fiberglass for decades, and the Elise's fiberglass body has the same advantages and drawbacks as all similarly covered cars that have preceded and followed it. As previously said, it's light, plus it doesn't rust because of course it's not metal. Another advantage of fiberglass is that it doesn't dent, so someone opening their car door into the side of your new bow may not be as disastrous as if you were in a metal-bodied car. With that being said, it also could be much worse, as rather than dent, fiberglass is prone to cracking, and repairing said cracks can be incredibly difficult. Plus, if the crack is unfixable, replacing the fiberglass clamshells is often so expensive the cost could write off your car. The Elise's interior also contributes to its lightweight by essentially not being there. It has wind-up windows rather than electric ones, no glove box, no carpet other than a small mat in each footwell, and certainly no sound deadening in the cabin. Only the driver's side seat is on rails to move forward and backwards, and initially the car was even sold without a driver's side airbag. When in the car, you're acutely aware that you're essentially strapping yourself to the aluminium chassis, and there are no frills to suggest otherwise. I'm certainly not saying this in a negative way though. The Elise's interior contributes to a wonderfully Lotus experience. Well, apart from the switches behind the steering wheel, which are taken from a Peugeot parts bin, and the indicator stalks which can be found on various Vauxhall models from the 1990s. Fortunately, all of Lotus's meticulous weight saving paid off, as the Elise has a hugely impressive curb weight of just 730 kilograms. That's 240 kilograms lighter than a Mazda MX-5 Mark II, and a truly enormous 610 kilograms lighter than a Porsche 986 Boxster S. An equally impressive comparison is that upon launch, the Elise S1 weighed just 42 kilograms more than Lotus's 1969 Elan S4, which is an incredible feat when you consider the safety regulations modern cars need to abide by that so often add considerable weight. It is worth noting though that Lotus didn't meet the initial target weight they set when they started Project M111, which was a positively ludicrous 550 kilograms. As touched on earlier, not all of the Lotus Elise S1 is all Lotus. The wing mirrors are taken from a Rover Metro, and apparently its air vents were even taken from the same parts bin as those in a Ferrari F40. However, the most notable off-the-shelf component on the car is its engine. Sat in the middle of the car, just behind the driver and passenger seats, is the 1.8 litre Rover K-Series engine, an engine that very much has its strengths and its weaknesses. Lotus chose the Rover K-Series engine primarily because of its size and weight, and in order to achieve these attributes, it's fairly advanced. Both the head and the block of the 4-valve engine are made of cast aluminium, and it even has narrower than usual bearings on the crankshaft that contribute to the lightness, like on F1 engines of the time. As a result, the engine weighed just 96 kilograms. Comparatively, a Honda S2000 engine weighs around 148 kilograms, and on a Mazda MX-5 Mark II, the 1.8 litre engine weighs approximately 150 kilograms. So in terms of lightness, the Lotus Elise's engine really is quite impressive. The engine's dyno figures show that the standard Elise isn't a car about power. The K-Series produces around 118 brake horsepower at 5,500 RPM and 122 pound-feet of torque at a handedly low 3,000 RPM. Whilst these figures aren't particularly stirring, the max torque arriving so early in the rev range ensures the car feels very handy pulling out of corners. So the K-Series engine does have some pretty good points that certainly explain why Lotus chose it for the Elise. Unfortunately, however, there is some yang to its yin. Lots of trouble, usually serious. This jokey acronym for Lotus has been a favourite with its fans since, well, forever. And it's been earned due to the lack of reliability that has plagued so many of the company's creations throughout its history. And the K-Series engine did nothing to help dispel this reputation. Whilst technologically quite advanced, in places the quality control of the engine was poor, due to engine thermostats failing on a misdesigned cooling system, and the fact that for a while Rover used plastic dowels in the engine instead of steel ones to save money. The Elise's 1.8 litre engine developed a reputation for tearing apart head gaskets, sometimes after just 18,000 miles from new. In fact, at times, quality control on the engine was so bad, A well-noted reason for head gasket failures on new engines was because when being built at the Rover factory, the bolts in the engine were often incorrectly torqued, meaning they weren't tightened to the right tightness, which caused the engine head to lift and vibrate and destroy the head gasket. Such rudimentary tasks messed up. I imagine Lotus must have been quite angry about all this because they also chose the K-Series engine as it was going to be cost effective. However, in the end, apparently it was very expensive due to Rover being concerned with, and here I'm quoting the Rover powertrain department, doing things very correctly when producing the K-Series engine. But now let's say you've got yourself a Lotus Elise S1 and it's in rude health and there's no signs of the engine failing and overheating itself to the temperature of 1,000 suns. Then how fast can it go? And how does it compare to some of its rivals? Well, let's say a Lotus Elise, a Porsche 986 Boxster S, a 1995 Alfa Romeo Spider 3-litre V6, an MG-F, a Mazda MX-5 Mark II, and a Lotus Elan M100 S2, all lined up on a drag strip outside a spare parts store. From 0 to 60 miles per hour, provided the K-Series engine allows it to get there, the Elise records a respectable time of 5.8 seconds. The considerably more powerful Porsche Boxster S does beat the lightweight Lotus to 60 miles an hour, but only by 0.3 of a second. The Alfa Romeo is 0.8 of a second slower to 60 miles an hour than the Elise, and a tenth behind the Alfa is Lotus's previous convertible small sports car sold in the 90s, the Elan M100 S2. Second slowest is the Mazda MX-5 Mark II, which takes an extra 1.9 seconds to reach 60 miles an hour when compared to the Elise. And finally, bringing up the rear is the MG-F, which has an identical 1.8 litre K-Series engine with an identical 118 brake horsepower as the Lotus Elise, but reaches 60 miles an hour in 8.5 seconds, 2.7 seconds slower than the Lotus, demonstrating just how right Colin Chapman was to prioritise lightweight over everything else. Over the quarter mile, covering the stretch in 14.2 seconds, the Elise again is beaten by the more powerful Boxster S, this time by 0.2 of a second. But again, considering that the Porsche has more than twice the power of the Lotus Elise, this slim margin is impressive for the little car from Hethel. Behind the Elise is its brother from a Norfolk mother. The Elan takes an extra 1.2 seconds to complete the quarter mile. Next is the Alfa Romeo and the MX-5, both of which finished a quarter mile 1.7 seconds behind the Lotus. And again, the MG-F crosses the quarter mile last, around 2.6 seconds later than the Elise. On to top speed. This is where our star car takes a bit of a beating. If your ears can handle the wind noise, the Lotus Elise will accelerate all the way to 126 miles an hour. This is far behind the Porsche, whose power really makes a difference here with its mighty top speed of 164 miles an hour. The Alfa Romeo stretches far ahead of the Elise too, reaching a commendable top speed of 145 miles an hour. And interestingly, the older Lotus Elan M100 actually has a higher top speed than the Elise, at 133 miles an hour. This is owed to its extra 36 horsepower and its slightly more aero-efficient shape. The MX-5 Mark II and its extra 12 horsepower just beat the Lotus, with a top speed of 127 miles an hour. In fact, the only car not to have a top speed advantage over the Lotus is the MG-F, which tops out short of the Elise at 120 miles an hour. So in comparison to its rivals, the Lotus Elise S1 mostly performs well, particularly so when one considers that straight line capabilities were never a high priority to Lotus when designing the car. It was made to dominate around corners and on country lanes rather than outdrag a BMW off the traffic lights. However, something that really makes the Elise stand out when compared to its rivals is how well the car has maintained its value. When launched in 1996, the Elise cost £18,950, and the car sold well. In its first year on sale, Lotus sold more cars than it had ever before in a single year of the company's history, and between September of 1996 and 2001, Lotus sold just over 8,600 standard Elise S1s. That is a huge number for Lotus, who until the release of the Elise considered selling 1,000 cars per annum to constitute as a very good year for the company in terms of sales. The rampant sales of the Elise essentially saved Lotus from bankruptcy, who were spiralling into a crater of debt owing to the financial failure of the Elan M100 and the ever-shrinking sales of the aging Esprit. So much was resting on the success of the Elise that Lotus essentially went all in and spent 2 years worth of Lotus Engineering's research budget in order to develop the Elise. Lotus Engineering is the second half of the Lotus company and does engineering for external clients. At the time it was also the only part of the company that was actually making any money, so Lotus really did risk it all on the Elise. Happily, the risk paid off, and including later Series 1 Elises, which I'll touch on later, over 10,000 of the cars were sold. This actually makes the car not particularly rare in classic Lotus terms, and yet, today, many examples of the car are advertised for around £20,000, and rising. Meanwhile, the Porsche 986 Boxster S, a car that, when new, cost just over £36,000 without options, has fared more than a little worse. Nowadays, you can find a good example Porsche 986 Boxster S for around £7,000 to £8,000. So that car has gone from being worth double the Elise to currently being worth less than half of the Elise. And it's not like the Boxster is a bad car. In fact, I believe it's an excellent car with some wonderful history behind it. So this switch in values demonstrates just how well revered the Elise S1 is in the market. If you are on the lookout for an Elise S1, be sure to check the steel rear subframe for corrosion, the fiberglass bodywork for cracks, and take a good look at the floor of the car. Check for ripples in the aluminium, as this could well be a sign of crash damage. It's super hard to fix, and a new replacement aluminium tub, if you can find one, costs over £10,000. Oh, and check the fabric roof for tears and broken rods. The fold-away roof was possibly the worst designed part of the entire car. It's a huge fiddle to put up, and when in a frustrated hurry, owners have been known to accidentally break the support rods that shape the roof. Of course, what's going to affect the value of an Elise more than almost anything is which Elise it is, because during the S1's production run, Lotus made a number of variations and special editions. I'll take you through them now. Let's start in 1997. 2 years after Lotus first unveiled the Elise, they revealed this, the Elise Sport 190. Built to order by the Lotus aftermarket department, the Elise Sport 190 was a track weapon. Actually, it was so track orientated that a passenger seat was an optional extra. As the name suggests, the car put out a massive 190 PS that propelled its stripped out body to 60 miles an hour in just 4.3 seconds and gave the Elise Sport 190 a top speed of 145 miles an hour. The car also had competition quality suspension, brakes, wheels and tyres, and a reinforced gearbox to handle all that extra power. After that came the Lotus Elise Sport 135. This was launched in 1998 and had some substantial upgrades over the standard Elise, whilst being considerably less performance focused than the Sport 190. The 135 did have a higher than standard tune on its engine, which gave out, of course, 135 PS. Plus, it also had a sports exhaust, drilled iron brake discs like on the 190, Corbo sport seats, and a close ratio gearbox. Then there was the 50th anniversary edition Elise, launched in 1998 too. The car is essentially a slightly dressed up version of the standard Elise, with a green metallic body, two-tone leather seats and gold wheels. What makes this car interesting is that it wasn't made to celebrate the company's 50th anniversary. Lotus wasn't technically founded until 1952. It instead celebrates the 50th anniversary of when the company's founder, Colin Chapman, created his first racing car in 1948, a car that became known as the Mark I Lotus. 1999 was a particularly busy year for new editions of the Elise. In January, Lotus launched the 111S. This car had a further improved Rover K-Series engine, this one with variable valve control and a power output increased to 143 brake horsepower. This lowered its 0 to 60 time to 5.4 seconds and increased its top speed to 133 miles an hour. The car also had new 6-spoke wheels with wider rear tyres, a carbon effect dashboard, the same close ratio gearbox as on the Sport 135, and a larger rear spoiler. The critics loved the standard Elise. However, after driving the 111S, many felt that this was the car Lotus should have released in the first place. In March, Lotus unveiled the Motorsport Elise at the Geneva Motor Show, a purpose-built race car made for an all-Lotus racing series that supported the British Touring Car Championship. The car made over 200 horsepower and was dressed aggressively in a body kit with an enormous wing on the back. In many ways, it was a taste of what was to come in terms of the Lotus Exige. In July of 1999, Lotus launched the Elise Heritage Edition. Upon the request of the Italian Lotus dealer network, Lotus created 100 left-hand drive Elises in black with gold wheels, grills, and sometimes wing mirrors. The cars were basically a homage to the Lotus Ford Type 79 F1 car, famously known as the John Player Special car. However, because Lotus didn't hold the rights to the JPS livery, they couldn't outwardly say that it was, so instead they called it the Heritage Edition. And to make the intent of their car even more obvious, they also made 31 right-hand drive Elises identically decorated, which they called the Type 79, the same name as their famed race car. In the next month, Lotus unveiled this, the 340R. 340 were built, hence the name, and the car weighed less than 700 kilograms. This car had a VHPD K-Series engine. VHPD stands for Very High Performance Derivative, which sounds pretty awesome, and it had a power output of 170 brake horsepower, which gave the car a 0 to 60 time of 4.4 seconds. The 340R was derived from the Elise rather than actually being a special edition. However, if it can be considered an Elise, it's certainly one of the most valuable, as back in October 2017, one was listed for sale for £90,000. The car only cost £35,000 when new. Now that is an investment. The front end of the car also gave the world a bit of a look at what the Elise Series 2 would look like. Not that we knew that at the time, of course. In October of 1999, Lotus showed that they weren't quite done saluting their F1 greatness when they unveiled the Elise Type 49, which was painted in the same red, gold and white colour scheme as their Lotus Type 49 World Championship winning F1 car from the late 1960s. Personally, I think this may be the most beautiful Elise. And in the same month, Lotus showed off the Elise Millennium Edition, which came with a variety of aesthetic differences including an Atlantis blue body and an Alcantara steering wheel plus Alcantara sill trim panels. In February of 2000, Lotus unveiled the Elise Sport 160, which produced 160 PS, or thereabouts anyway. Power output did actually fluctuate slightly over the years. Initially, the car was only available in either Scandal Green or Metallic Black. However, after a while, the car was available in the full colour range. The car had the same rear spoiler as on the Elise 111S, however it was raised up even further than on that car. The Sport 160 was pretty expensive. With a base price of £28,995, it was over £10,000 more than the standard Elise. However, evidently, the demand was there, as Lotus sold 319 of these cars, even though the Elise S1 was approaching the end of its production life. And that's the lot. Oh, no, actually there was another Elise, and it was a little different to the rest. The Lotus Elise GT1. This car was unveiled on the 21st of November 1996, before all but the standard Elise. I just left this one until last to worry Elise superfans that I'd forgotten about it. Known internally as Type 115, the Elise GT1 was made by Lotus to compete against cars such as the Porsche 911 GT1 and the Mercedes CLK GTR in the FIA GT Championship. The GT1 chassis was based on the regular Elises, however everything else is different. The body is made of carbon fibre rather than fiberglass. It's 765mm longer than the regular Elise and 316mm wider than the standard car too. Yet despite its bulkier size, it weighed just 900 kilograms. The Elise GT1 road car was fitted with a Lotus twin-turbo V8 engine that produced 542 horsepower at 6,000 RPM. The factory race cars, however, that competed in the GT Championship were fitted with a Chevrolet twin-turbo V8 that produced 607 horsepower at 7,200 RPM. This was enough to propel the race car from 0 to 60 miles per hour in just 3.2 seconds, whilst the road car did it in 3.8 seconds and had a top speed just shy of 200 miles an hour. When I say road car, I'm talking in the singular. Not because Lotus only made one edition of the Elise GT1 road car. Nope, they made just one Elise GT1 road car. By cleverly interpreting the FIA GT Championship homologation rules, Lotus realised that they only had to produce a single roadworthy Elise GT1 and didn't even have to sell it. Only having to produce one road car was hugely important, as it was the difference between Lotus being able to compete in the championship and not, due to their limited budget and the fact that each car was produced at a significant loss. Unfortunately, despite Lotus's smart skirting of the rules, the car didn't manage to make any major mark on the 1997 championship, failing to complete more races than it actually did finish, and its best result of 5th place actually came from a privateer team. Therefore, due to a disappointing season in which the car demonstrated it just was not built to compete with the higher budget cars, the factory team bowed out at the end of 1997 and the Elise GT1 was resigned to be a wonderful miscalculation by a company that was just too desperate to go racing. There's loads more I could say about the Elise GT1, but it deserves its own video so that I can really delve into the details of this car and its history. On a rare occasion, the Elise GT1 race cars do crop up for sale. Back in 2016, one was up for grabs in America at a cost of $645,000. So unless you're a multi-millionaire, I'd recommend starting by saving up for a standard Elise S1. The final Elise I'm going to talk about is different to all the others, in that it's not petrol powered. It's widely thought that the Tesla Roadster was the first electric car built on the Lotus Elise platform. However, this is incorrect. In 1997, British company Zytek, who make electric and hybrid powertrains for cars, put an electric powertrain into an S1 Lotus Elise and got excellent results. The car had regenerative braking, aiding to a range of up to 120 miles, could be charged in under an hour, and despite the two electric motors and heavy batteries, still weighed an impressively light 875 kilograms. The two motors produced around 200 horsepower, and the Zytek Lotus Elise could do 0 to 90 miles an hour in 11.2 seconds. That's faster than the standard 1.8 Elise S1. That being said, it did have its top speed limited to 90 miles an hour to conserve battery power. If you want to buy a Zytek Lotus Elise, all I can say is good luck. I'd say you've got a better chance of buying an Elise GT1, because these electric cars are rare. In fact, your best bet to ever even see one is to head to the British Motor Museum, where they have an example on display. This to me really demonstrates that whilst it's so unknown, and looks just like any standard Elise S1, it's actually a very important car in terms of the technical advances it demonstrated. What's not so rare though, are celebrity Elise S1 owners. Despite its modest price and less than luxurious trim, the car has attracted the checkbooks of many well-known names. JK from Jamiroquai had one in his enormous car collection, as did the petrolhead and Pink Floyd drummer Nick Mason. Apparently the car was also popular with footballers, as supposedly David Beckham and Joe Cole owned Elises too. Most notable and impressive of all though is that maverick F1 car designer Adrian Newey owned a Lotus Elise S1. Adrian Newey described the Elise S1 as what Lotus should have been making for the last 20 years. Now that is high praise. However, you don't design several championship winning F1 cars without being a bit of a perfectionist, and Adrian Newey evidently felt that his Elise needed more power. Enough in fact to give it the same power to weight ratio as a Ferrari F40. He put all kinds of modifications into his Elise, including a big old turbo which altogether gave his car 320 brake horsepower and a power to weight ratio of 400 horsepower per tonne. Quite something for what was described as Mr. Newey's runaround. Now, throughout this video, I've often described the Elise as the S1 Elise. This is because, as I'm sure you know, the story of this little yet mighty sports car didn't end in 2001 when its production ended primarily due to its crash structure no longer meeting European regulations. Instead, it was replaced with the Series 2 Elise that was announced on the 9th of October 2000 and went into production the next year. The Series 2 had a 10-year run until February of 2010 when the Series 3 was unveiled and remains on sale today. The future of the Lotus Elise is a little uncertain currently. Lotus were looking to introduce a new Series 4 in 2020. However, in 2017, Chinese car maker Geely bought a majority stake in the Norfolk-based company, and whilst the financial injection into the company is undoubtedly good, whether the Elise model will be continued or succeeded is not known. But whether Lotus maintain the Elise name or start afresh, I truly believe that they can continue to make cars that will draw admiration and custom for a further 24 years, provided they continue to keep in mind the words of their founder, Colin Chapman. Simplify. Then add lightness. So that was a detailed history of the Lotus Elise Series 1. I hope you enjoyed it and feel slightly more informed than you did 40 minutes ago. Thanks.